welcome to quite possibly the dumbest name talk ever, but naming is hard. This is called Veni, Vidi, Vici because the editorial experience has always kind of been a problem for me in Drupal, and it's something that I really, really care about. And we had this great opportunity at MLS to work on this editorial system for them, for their new system.
Could you speak into the mic?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, you can sit, you can go right here.
Yeah, okay. So you can introduce yourself, Brian.
So, my name is Brian Asnar. In addition to being an organizer of this conference, I'm also head of technology at Major League Soccer.
My name is Ellie Strelo. I am a senior developer at Phase 2.
Okay. So, I'm going to do a bit of setup, and then we're going to go right into Ellie's journey through the build out of our experience and our new platform. So, what are we talking about? What's the context of everything? Well, Major League Soccer has a custom Drupal 7 monolith. And we really embarked probably about a year and a half, or maybe even 2 years ago, to create a plan to get out of it. So this is the larger context. Our system powers all of our clubs. So that's 24 soccer sites that is running in a multi-tenant, multi-site Drupal instance. So Drupal 7 is just the one process serving all of our sites. Where we are in the process is we're really just getting out of a plethora of POCs. There was a lot to prove. There was a lot to make sure that worked. We had to make sure that the architectures that we're proposing were sound, and so we're getting out of that and we're getting into build out. So that's where we're at. We are coming off of a recently launched React Native product. So the Major League Soccer mobile application is completely React Native. It's not the first React project, actually. It's probably the third or fourth React project we've done at Major League Soccer. And like many organizations, we once started out as mostly PHP Drupal developers 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago. And now let's say we're focusing where our Drupal and PHP energies are. And we're majority JavaScript and React Native. So, React.js with some React Native. But this React Native project really gave Major League Soccer a lot of learnings, and not just in technology, not just in reusability, but in process. It overhauled how we work with our design and experience teams. So what we really wanted to do was take as much of the lessons learned and apply that to really what was going to become our biggest project, which is the replatform. And I briefly mentioned we want to maximize the resources that we have, that are JavaScript and React, primarily JavaScript and React. And the vision was, in Major League Soccer engineering, you can work on the mobile application, you can work on the website, you can work in the backend, because our backend is mostly JavaScript. And this really created what I thought was like the most engaging, and it maximizes the developer happiness, essentially. And that's what we wanted to do. But, yeah, let's get that. So, specifically for the CMS, these are the high-level, salient talking points I wanted to bring to the group. Definitely not all of them, but let's say these were crucial in picking the platform that we're going to go with. Now, one other thing I didn't mention in terms of setup is that we were open to completely leaving Drupal. So that was actually an option, and we wanted to test that option. So given that, we were looking at CMSs that support these things. Probably one of the most important things I would say is sports data. So what does sports data really mean? Well, that means that we need the ability to support both structured and unstructured content. Sports data is highly, highly relational. The way we store our information with each match, we have lots of data points for each match, and this match information needs to be organized in a way so that we can roll it up into seasonal information for our entire, for our past soccer seasons. And it was something that we really couldn't budge on. One trend you'll see with a lot of the new CMSs is that most are going towards a document model, some kind of open-ended NoSQL-like repository, which makes perfect sense because it provides ultimate flexibility. But we couldn't really go all in on that kind of that approach. We needed something that provided both, which was actually one of the most challenging things. We evaluated many CMSs. I'm going to talk about that, but this is one of the most important requirements that kept recurring. It was a difficult requirement to get answered or to get a good solution for it. Well, like anybody who's looking to go portable, anybody who's looking to go decoupled, we wanted the most portable content. No HTML, no markup. Editors should not know about HTML, anything. Bare minimum markup. Let's call it bold italics. And we needed whatever content we created. It had to work in a connected television application, mobile, web, and actually equally important is our content distribution, which we have various APIs, which we get our content to all of our partners, ESPN, various OTT providers like Pluto. All of this needed to have really, really consistent structure in terms of, the way the paragraphs are laid out, the way videos are included in them. So that's the portability I'm speaking of. Specifically the experience, we wanted the technology and the library that was going to govern the front end experience. We needed it to be really customizable and extensible. As I mentioned, a lot of our teams React has a React skill set, so we really wanted to maximize that and get React, really just double down on React. In addition to headless, we wanted something that was microservice friendly. We wanted something we could break up. We wanted the CMS itself to be, if possible, used in as large or as small of a way as possible. We wanted something that was on-prem, not SaaS. And finally, we wanted something that was proven. We didn't want to be the canary in the mine here, because let's face it, we're kind of like in the golden age of CMSs in a way. I think last I counted, there was like about 80 CMSs that I was going through of which, maybe 20 were from the last 2 years. So there's a lot to look at, and you really want to be sure about the direction you go. So we wanted something that was proven, we wanted something that was open source, and we wanted something that's strong in the community. That includes support, documentation, all those things. All right, so here is let's call it the top 5. There was many CMSs we looked at, like I mentioned, but these are the 5 I'll talk about. Vox. Well, Vox is a pretty major brand. They have pretty strong product out there. I think a lot of the Vox articles that I've read, the experience is pretty strong. We really liked it. It was very robust from a CMS point of view. However, it was not as flexible and extendable as we wanted. It was monolith, and that kind of brought us to Arc. Arc is Washington Post CMS. We really like it. And by the way, all of these CMSs, this isn't like better worse to better or anything. This is really more about what the aforementioned requirements I brought up. So I actually was quite happy with a lot of these CMS. I was quite surprised and pleased. So with ARC, Washington Post created a really strong offering in the CMS. It's React-based. It is extremely fully featured. To the point where I really had to arm wrestle with product to not choose this. We're talking A/B content testing at the field level. It has a really well-defined content model, both Vox and ARC. If you're going with something like Washington Post or Vox, best believe these are proven brands that kind of have addressed problems that you will either have or will have. So it was a very probably one of the most interesting content models I've seen, but it was not as easy to alter as we wanted. So we wanted, again, that flexibility. And lastly, sports data. What I mean by sports data in the red is that it wasn't as, let's just say it wasn't as well suited to represent highly relational sports data in conjunction with open-ended, non-structured articles. By the way, when I say that, what I mean by that is just imagine, an editor experience where they're typing in a title and maybe a couple of graphs, and then you add an image, and then you add a video player, and then you add the next 3 matchups, or let's say you add a scoreboard, or you add things that are highly customized components that have some need to integrate with some kind of relational system. Clay was really awesome, actually. So many props to the NY Mag team. Clay powers actually all of the NY Mag brands. So, Grubhub, The Cut, well, there's a bunch. So, all of them. It is a really strong microservice architecture. In fact, I encourage you to just check it out. It's on GitHub. It's github.com/clay. And they organized all of the functionality within the CMS pretty well. Choose what you want. Really cool. I put Vue in green because that's cool. But we're React lovers, so yeah, that actually was more of a nice, but we wanted more React support. And then sports data. So similar with Washington Post, you could put in a component really, that could probably fit really well, but not in the way that enabled the robustness that we needed to put relational data into our articles. All right, last 2. Drupal paired with versus Gutenberg. So one thing that kind of guided our diligence was with WordPress Gutenberg. I believe, I forget, there was a talk in Pantheon maybe 2 DrupalCons ago that was talking about what WordPress did with, at that time, the new launch of Gutenberg. There were some product people with me in the audience, and I gotta tell you, we laughed and they were like, "Whoa, WordPress is awesome!" Strictly from an editorial experience point of view. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that's where they donated all of their efforts, is just the editorial experience. So anyways, needless to say, that experience was something that our editors really wanted, and really our product team wanted to get to our editors. So obviously we looked at the Gutenberg Drupal port, our project. Now, we liked how close it was to WordPress. If you go to the Gutenberg site, it's the Gutenberg Drupal site. It's really cool. You can demo it and play, play with dummy content. It's really cool. But the thing we also liked about Gutenberg was that it was the back end. It was back end agnostic, so you could work with really any back end you wanted. So that worked for us. Now the knock here was that the structure of the content was really let's say, focused on HTML. And I think that's coming from the WordPress architecture. So that kind of went against our JSON requirement. And it was a little buggy. Okay, penultimate, mobile doc. Mobile doc was really cool. It framework agnostic as well. JSON, not HTML, so that was really great. Though, as I say that, when you looked at how the JSON was stored, not the greatest. And in fact, when you looked at how the JSON was stored, you could tell that it was coming from a Drupal system, right? Like lots of arrays, lots of nested arrays, things that's were not elegant. The community activity was not where we wanted it to be. And along with that, the documentation was light. So, that brings us to Slate. So, with Slate, we could produce a very medium Gutenberg-like experience, and we love that. Open source. I believe it had like the most active community and all that.
Yeah, from what we saw.
From what we saw, yeah, the community was pretty strong, and at least there was recent contributions to it and something like that. React compatible, so yay. Very customizable and extensible. In fact, I think Ellie mentions to me, and I can't get this phrase out of my mind. It is literally a slate. It is like a blank slate you can build off of. So kudos to the team for appropriately naming the project. The JSON storage was top notch. Ellie will go into the details with that, of how actually the JSON is stored in the Drupal database, and we like the way that was implemented. And the integration with Drupal was really, really, really clean. I think it's extremely sensible. All of this also Ellie was about to go over as well. So here's what the architecture of our systems looks like / is gonna look like. Okay, so there's gonna be a lot of yada yada in here, so I already apologize. But basically, the box on the right is the system we're building out. This everything on the left is in production. There's other things too. I took it out, but really what we have here is from the back end, we've got a federated GraphQL service layer. We've got upstream REST services that really are for configuration, for statistics, and for content. The content API, you will note, is Node.js. And you will also note that it is reading from an Elasticsearch backend. And we'll get into that very shortly. So now we'll talk about all the new stuff. So what you see in terms of the web applications, you've got 3 web applications. One is in Drupal admin. 2, you've got this shared components project. This is where all of our components are going to go. And 3, you will see the layered boxes there, which really represent our multi-tenant league and club sites. So 24 of those. And the idea here is that you create your content in Drupal. It is stored in Drupal MySQL, which for us, all of our databases are Aurora, all of our DBMSs are Aurora. And then it is indexed into Elasticsearch. So our plan is to index like crazy in Elasticsearch so that we can query it all of the ways that you could possibly query our content. What this is going to do is it's going to set us up so that the main repository that is going to serve our public traffic is going to be Elasticsearch. Sorry, the main backend is going to be Elasticsearch with our content API, which is Node.js, and GraphQL. Right? So if you look at this, who knows about Drupal? Not Drupal knows about Drupal, that's about it. So what this also sets us up for is the fact that, actually, there's one more thing I wanted to mention, and that is, you'll see there's Drupal here, right? We talked about that we ended up choosing Drupal with Slate. The fact that Drupal is there is kind of amazed me, because we actually challenged ourselves to get off of Drupal, but the requirement of structured with unstructured, was something that we only got with Drupal. Now, truth be told, there were so many CMSs that the diligence on this could have gone out forever. And so one other thing was, well, it seemed like Drupal was the best choice given all of our diligence, but we also wanted to say, well, just in case it wasn't, let's architect this system in a way so that we could possibly phase out a CMS swap in a later phase, which also simplifies the actual replatform project in general. So really we're just focusing on the build out of our application, how it's stored, and then the CMS part, we don't have to go through the retraining, and our editors can feel somewhat familiar with Drupal-like concept, although we are drastically changing things, but nonetheless, we can sort of say, if we're going to do a CMS change, we'll do that at a later time. So what you've got here is pretty decoupled. What else to mention about this? Actually, I wanted to say one other thing. I wanted to do some honorable mentions. We also looked at Netlify CMS. We also looked at Strappy.io. We also looked at Ghost. We also looked at Delta Trips. Lots of CMSs, lots of great CMSs, but these were the ones at the top. Now, one little note, I wanted to just also mention, one tip I like to give is, if you are curious about a CMS, I always say, try to use any CMS that you're interested in some kind of minor project that isn't critical to your business. So for us, marketing sites. Marketing sites tend to come and go, so why not try something that's drastically out there, test the water. And in fact, today with phase 2, we just launched a site for a new tournament that Major League Soccer is having, Leagues Cup, and it is done with Netlify, CMS, and Gatsby, and we're pretty happy with how that turned out.
Leaguescup.com.
Thanks, Blue. Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to go into a little bit more of the technical things about how we worked with Slate, but I have a demo video of our actual Slate instance. It might be a little difficult to see, but this is me adding just a standard paragraph. We tried to mimic the Medium interface by adding a plus sign whenever you create a new paragraph. This text formatting plugin is actually available to download from Slate itself. It's actually a little bit modified. Actually, I start adding a couple of more embedded things after this paragraph. Oh, I just inserted a link. Sorry, it's a little bit slow moving. I wonder if I can speed it up.
Yeah, it's good.
It's good?
Yeah.
Oh no. Sorry. I'll go back to that spot. Okay, so I'm adding lists. You just saw kind of a flash of the embed toolbar. You'll see that again in a minute. But I wanted to show numbered lists. After this, I show a bulleted list. Actually, because those are pretty straightforward, I'm actually going to skip ahead a little bit. Oh, I wanted to show the section divider. That's actually one of the custom components that we developed. It's literally just an HR tag right now. It'll change in the future, I'm sure. We also support up to H4. You can, a header is actually its own block, and we support up to H4, but you can support any number of headers that you want. Right in this part of the clip, I'm actually adding a Cloudinary image. Cloudinary integration was one of the things that they actually asked us for pretty early on. I'm actually inserting a photo that I downloaded from the MLS site, and now I think I'm going to switch out with something else. Yeah, so this editor, even though it's a framework or a base, it works it has a lot of the same built-in functionality that you would expect from a live editor. And we actually added functionality. Slate has built-in functionality to listen for dragging and dropping. There's a bunch of different event modifiers that you can take a look at. But I wanted to show that that's actually a brand new image now in my Cloudinary account. So I just clicked and dragged it from my desktop. I wanted to make sure that I remembered to insert quoted text, even though that's not as big of a deal. That's literally just a block quote. I think here's where I actually throw in some more images. I actually threw in a picture of the women's soccer team because I was so proud. Yeah, and we actually added the action to double click to change the image value later on as well. We actually recently added this functionality to realign content. That's actually completely custom that we developed. And we also added this caption functionality more recently too. Yeah, each time that you create a new paragraph in the instance that we built, it brings up a plus sign like in the medium editor. So that when you click on that, it actually brings up that embed toolbar. I add a video, drop in an MLS video, and actually clicking on the video in the editor won't play it. That's actually a voided component, which I'm actually going to show later. A voided component basically says that you can't change something inside of, you can't like change text inside of that component. The tweet component is a completely custom component, but what we're doing with that is we're utilizing the publicly available, I think it's called Tweet Embed library. So it's literally just a library that provides a React component, and as long as you pass the ID as a prop, it'll show up. This is a completely custom written component that I just added. I'm going to pause it here for a second because I delete it pretty quickly, but this is a completely custom plugin, yeah, you could call it a plugin, where we're pulling data from MLS's GraphQL endpoint to show the player data. That's Jorge Perales, he's on Chicago Fire. We're currently only pulling Chicago Fire just to prove that we could do it, but it's showing his position on the field, which is defense, and his jersey number. And I think I showed how to, no, I didn't show how to switch it out, but essentially with this same component, you can it's the same interaction where you double click the component and it brings up this list of players from Chicago Fire.
And I just want to note, this is literally one of the things we absolutely had to have happen because we're going to keep building this out. This is a representation of integrating structured data with unstructured.
Right, and it gives us the ability to, this was another area where we really, really needed that shared components library that we've been doing, where the player card, as we're calling it, is like, it's got to look a certain way everywhere it's being shown. And I noted that it works like any other editor where if you click on the element and hit delete or backspace, it'll actually remove it. This was another huge development that we put in was the work with columns and nested elements. I'm writing some paragraphs inside of the actual columns. I'm about to throw a Cloud and Mary image in there too, just to display that we were making sure that we could also embed images in there as well. And the plus sign actually pops up when you're actually inside of the Cloud and Mary, the columns too. And I think that's the end of the video. Yeah, we took this video last week, actually. So this is a pretty good representation of where we still are, but we are continuing development on that. So, because there's not a lot of documentation on how to create a new Slate app, I wanted to make sure that I outline those steps here. So, pretty obvious one is to install Node.js. Make sure that you have Create React App or some way to create a new, Create React App was the quick start for us. It had everything we needed in it. And we're eventually going to utilize the testing inside of it. We're using some parts of React scripts serve. We're using a bunch of the React scripts. After you create the Create React app, after you use Create React app to create an app, you have to install Slate React, and Immutable is actually a peer dependency that you have to make sure that you install. And the reason why they're two packages for Slate is because Slate React is like its bridge to React, where it adds that compatibility to listen for JSX, for the components, make sure that hooks are being called. And these last two, steps 4 and 5, were really only, I wanted to note that we were using it for a monorepo situation. So what we're doing is we're sharing the components between, we have one repository that's literally just our components and Storybook. So we're using that repository to actually build out the components and then display them in Storybook, make sure that they're working properly. And then we have our separate repository for the front-end app, and then we have our Slate repository, which the front-end app and the Slate repository are both pulling in this third, the first repository that I mentioned that's just holding onto the components. We did this because we wanted to make sure that these components looked the same everywhere. So we wanted to make sure it had the same code, the same display. And part of developing Slate as its own repository, we also wanted to pull it in as a library for Drupal. So we're actually, step 4 is we created a demo page so that we could do local development on Slate. Obviously, we need to be able to see it when we work on it, so we actually have a live reload when we're changing code. And then when it comes time to release a new version, we actually created a build script to minify the Slate JavaScript and provide a map. And that's all it commits to a separate branch, and then it tags for release. And that's all that we're pulling into Drupal as a library. Here's a very vague example of what you should see in package.json after you install those 3 libraries. And you would run yarn start to start the demo page. There's some setup that you'd have to do after this that I'm going to explain in a minute. So for both the demo page and the Drupal app, this is actually the function that gets called upon page load. Render Slate, this function, we're pulling in the actual DOM element for the container where we have to anchor our React app. And then we have the save field that we are connecting to Drupal or in your demo page. I'm going to focus more on the Drupal side now. So in this case, we have a field with the ID, save field ID. And that's actually the HTML form field that it's going to be communicating with. This is how a lot of editors work under the hood. This is exactly how CK Editor works. It has to have that HTML form field to save that data. So that's actually where it drops the JSON to be saved into Drupal's database. When you'll see a direct diagram for this in a minute, but when Drupal saves that, you can either save it as a revision, or if you don't have revisions turned on, it's just going to save the node content. And then we're just making sure that we have the anchor and the save field before we attempt to render the editor. This is a standard method for rendering a React app, is react.render. And we actually have to register the function to the window itself so that Drupal knows where it is. So this is the actual editor component that we built. This is the surrounding component, our custom surrounding component around the built-in Slate editor component, which you can see on the second half of the slide. You'll notice that there is a blue box on the top surrounding an array called plugins, and that is containing a function call to a function called image. That is actually how Slate pulls in plugins. This is also where you can send in any customization or settings as arguments to that plugin. I'll show you the plugin anatomy in a minute. But that array is then included. If you look at the very bottom of the slide, you'll see plugins equals list.plugins. That's actually grabbing the list and executing the actual hooks and getting the schema from those plugins. This editor also has built into Slate. You can provide spell check and autofocus. Autofocus means that when you click on something, you can then listen for an event to see that it's being that it's in focus or it's being used. You'll notice that there's also value equals this.state.value, because there are actually two different pieces of the editor's value, where the editor stores one copy of the value, another copy is saved in the React component's state. So what you're not seeing on this slide is the state prop on the Slate editor component. So that we are actually making sure that they are in sync. On that, actually onChange function sends data to the state. So this is the anatomy of the plugin that we were just talking about. It's literally, so what you have to do when you build a plugin is you have to export a function that returns an object literal. This is about to get very JavaScripty, but there are some very specific keys that Slate looks for in that object literal that, you know, if you pass in some random key that it's not going to recognize. Schema is one of those keys that it's actually, I think it's the only key that's not expecting a function. This key actually contains like rules for what this block is supposed to be. In this case, we have this image block type or a node type. They're pretty interchangeable, and they're not like Drupal blocks and nodes, by the way. Slate's object model more closely resembles the browser DOM, which you'll see in the data model slide, which is next. Here we're telling the image block, you know, we don't actually have any text to edit in here, so we have to tell it void, and we're actually verifying that there's a data key because you can actually put data straight into the node in Slate, and that's usually where you store things like the image source. So in this case, we're actually verifying that the image source is an image URL. And actually, perhaps the more important part of this slide is the hook, where it's an example of a hook in Slate, where this hook fires every single time, this render node hook fires every single time a node is rendered in Slate. So it's very, very important that you, unless you want it to do stuff on every node render, you have to specify the actual node type, which is what I'm doing on the third line in that block. And that's where I'm actually returning the shared React component that we're using from our library. So if you look towards the top, we're pulling in import image from component library, and we're actually using that component at the very bottom of the slide. This is a little bit difficult to read, but this is Slate's data model, which was a little bit cleaner than mobile docs. You'll notice that the top level is a document which matches the browser object model. And then inside of that are blocks and texts and leaves, and there are inline pieces. These all pretty much mean the same thing as they do in the browser. In this case, we just have one paragraph that has no formatting. If we had, you'll notice I'll explain the marks stuff now, where like, if you had different markup in that, if you had different marks rather, meaning bold, italic, underline, that's actually contained in that last array all the way on the right. If you had different pieces of text in this document that were different marks, it would actually be an additional leaf inside of that leaves array. And then you'll notice actually in the top level of that nodes array, that's actually the top level block listing of the document. So each paragraph node is considered a block, and each of your components you can consider a new block. And these are completely nestable, and again, very, very clean data model compared to what we were seeing with mobile doc. I'm going to have to zip through this because we have like 5-10 minutes
You
left.
can go. It's a break after this. So.
Okay. I'm going to try to go quickly anyway. But so what we're doing on the Drupal side, we've been working with Drupal 8. So we downloaded the JSON field module, and we have been actually sending the Slate data to the JSON field in the UI. And then that data is being saved to the Drupal database, like I mentioned before. So what you can do is you can either create a custom field type that's long text if you don't really need that data to be searchable with the MySQL database. But the allure of having it searchable and just raw JSON in MySQL was huge for us. And like I said, you need the actual tag for Slate to anchor itself, like we mentioned before. And then we're actually importing Slate as a library. I kind of explained the build process where we're creating a new branch and actually tagging that. I wanted to include this because I actually had a really hard time figuring out how to pull a JavaScript library in from a GitLab repository that was tagged and private. So, and this is like, it might not be final, but I wanted to include this because I wanted to share the actual code. I also think I have it available as a public gist that you could straight up copy. There's actually a link to it on the slide. And I'm sure we'll provide these slides later. And this is the initial JavaScript that gets called by Drupal. We're basically just calling that render Slate function that we were talking about before from Drupal attach behaviors. So that, it renders once on page load and that's it. This also would be where if you have any Drupal settings, you would send them into this function call. Oh, this is that save function that I was talking about before. So this function gets fired every time the editor content changes. So remember the two values that I was talking about. One is the editor value, one is the state value in the editor component. We have to make sure that they don't match and then make sure they do have the same things in them. So that's basically what that if statement is doing. And it's also adding that actual save content to that HTML form field, which is the third or fourth line, this.props.savefield.value equals content. And then we're actually updating the state of the editor. This is the basic explanation of the workflow that I've been discussing. We just wanted to create a visualization for you to look at. This is kind of following the CRUD workflow. So when we create a new node in Drupal, we have the Slate editor being displayed with a base JSON document that we have defined, which is very close to the data model piece, the data model slide that you saw before. And then when that content is read back, we're pulling it from the database into that field, and then when the editor is rendered, it's just pulling that value from that field. And when we update it back, when we click node save, it actually just saves the content straight from that field, which is already being constantly updated by the editor. And we wanted to also show, I've worked with some sites where we had very structured content and editors needed super fine grain control, and the interface was, I don't use this word very often, it was bonkers. Like one block, when it's, let's say there is a preview for the block, but when you wanted to edit it, when you opened it up, it actually, so this is, I'm not going to name modules, but I think you can understand which one I'm referring to. When I edited one block, the whole block's field set would take up more space than the actual monitors was capable of showing. So scrolling through a page that had 20 content blocks on it was cumbersome and exhausting. And this is just, so much cleaner. Our work has only started here, but this is so much cleaner than what I've had to deal with in the past. So I didn't know if you wanted to sum up or if I should.
Oh, typos. So, Drupal 8 plus Slate might be a good direction for you if you have the need to have both structured and unstructured data. I mean, I think that kind of sums it up. I mean, otherwise, there's lots of CMSs out there, but I think, Drupal really kind of shined here. What else? Oh, you want as much control of the editorial interface as your imagination can afford. Especially if you're inspired by Medium or Gutenberg, WordPress Gutenberg. You wanted a CMS that had first-class support of React components. Now, this is important. I mean, when we started our first set of React applications, we realized that what if we could everything could be composed with, could be composable with reusable components, and what if that expanded across all of our products? So, I mean, look, the vision here is that certain components which are complicated could be possibly even written once and shared across all products, right? Now, this requires that you do have some use of React Native, for web, mobile, and all the things. I personally wouldn't suggest React Native Web for an entire website, but React.js and React Native can live together. So if you're thinking of this kind of approach, I would say this is a good way to go. You're looking not only to store your data in JSON, but you want an efficient way to store that JSON, and you want it to be to read really friendly. You're looking for portable content, and finally, you've been battling with the field interface like most people who use Drupal, tend to battle with. I mean, look, it's quite flexible for sure. But once the editors know what they can do in Drupal, God help you. So I mean, look, really, what we were doing here, we're trying to find a way we can balance giving editors flexibility, but without giving them guns to shoot themselves with, right? And so what we've got here is we've got the ability to sort of, carefully curate a flexible experience for the editors, and we really feel this is the way to do it. I mean, one thing Ellie showed, which I was really happy with, Ellie, that when she did that one demo with the layout, she had plus, and then there was a layout experience. I mean, that could go all the way across to to having specific layouts for specific permissions. Oh, that's one other thing I should have mentioned. You still want to take advantage of all the things of Drupal that you do like. Permissioning, workflow, revision, all of those things. Right?
Yeah, we're actually using some of the permission workflow. We actually have a layout builder piece of this too that we didn't get to show, where the editor side is just pulling in schema that's expecting to see a certain layout, but the layout builder is actually where you build that schema. So you can say, I want an image at the top of this article, and it's supposed to have at least one paragraph. That's the editor is actually pulling that in, and the editor, there's a permission that we have being sent in right now just to prove that we can, where we have a role for editors who actually can't change that layout, but if you are an admin, you can.
And I think that's about it. Anything you can think about? Anything else?
That's it.
Questions? In the back.
Questions.
I came in a few minutes late. I may have missed it. At what point, is there a process where you view the node and that JSON gets turned back into HTML?
That would theoretically, we don't actually have that in place yet, but that would theoretically be placed into the front-end app itself, where the idea is when you click the preview button in Drupal, it'll actually bring you to the front-end app, and that's where you would see the preview of the node.
Okay. But is it possible to use this as just a decoupled editing experience, but still use Drupal to render the quick node template and have it spit out the HTML while it goes?
Interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'm sure you could. This is such a, I'm going to use the term blank slate again. This is such a blank slate that you can do literally anything with it. The fact that it outputs JSON, I think, was a far greater ability than outputting HTML at first. But you could.
I presume there's a JavaScript method that says, given this JSON to spit out HTML.
Yeah, so what happens is on the front end app, the theory is that once you get that type that we were talking about a bunch of slides ago in the actual data model, you'll see the object block type paragraph piece. The type is where it would be, okay, type image in the other example. That's where on the editor side, it knows to map the image type to the image component. We would have the same logic operating on the front end, saying when this block, like we're cycling through these blocks on the front end, we say if the type is image, we want to show this image component with the data inside. Does that make sense?
Bloom.
I missed this. What are you doing? Any kind of like local caching in case someone accidentally hits back and like, oh, I messed up, and does the form state safe for them?
Wait, so can you, if someone messes up in the editor?
Yeah. So for instance, is this data shape stored to local storage so that if they accidentally refresh the page or they navigate away, they're able to return to it?
So I don't think it'll save if they navigate away. No, we would have to. Actually, that's a pretty good idea to add for implementation.
That was a requirement. Thanks, Bloom. Brand new requirement. Hot off the press.
I'm sure as part of this save function, you could say like, anytime something changes, throw it into local storage just in case. Yeah, that's actually a fantastic idea.
And the local
Thank you.
storage is just like the step between the key press and then the column.
Yeah, so this function fires every time the editor every time you make a keystroke inside of the editor. Or, there's also, they actually also provide pretty good documentation on creating undo and redo buttons, which is also just changing the state inside of the editor. So whenever that happens.
You put it right between const content and just press it right there.
Yeah.
One line.
I think Bloom just requested GitLab access. Self-serve.
What metadata did you have to deal with? And 'cause obviously we didn't see a lot of metadata editing screenshots that you showed. And who was responsible for updating that content? And which component of your system was responsible for dealing with that data?
So if you're talking about metadata from things like the embeds, with the Cloudinary service, they actually have support for all of that metadata at first, and you can actually define your custom metadata. As far as using the more generic image plugin that we originally started out with, where you just throw the image URL in there, that's actually the caption, for instance, would have probably been used as the alt tag or the title prop. That a lot of this, because Slate is a framework to create an editor on top of, you would actually have to create the interface to get that data. So the interface that I have here is actually a little bit incomplete. The idea is hopefully if we are moving towards using that particular image plugin, not Cloudinary, we would actually have to create a popover or some sort of form entry in order to pull in that custom entered metadata.
And what about metadata outside of the Slate interface? Did you have other metadata that Drupal had to manage, perhaps about page, URL slugs, categorization?
Have we gotten that far yet?
No, we haven't. But I think we've already anticipated that. When we get to that crossroads, and I think it's going to come down to Slate. It could go something like this. Everything that's going to be optional and uber flexible is in Slate. Everything that's required, and let's say a content type. We're talking content types now. So what defines the content type? One thing we're trying to go towards is, we don't have so many like content types anymore. We're gonna have fewer content types that are really flexible, but the ones that we do that are distinct are going to be distinct for reasons like they require I don't know, like a player name, and a player bio. So like a player content type would be like one thing it's going to have things that might be outside of Slate, something like that.
We've got a question over here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to know if you have versioning. That's question number one. Question number two is, have you tried, I saw that you have Drupal 8 plus Slate. Have you tried Drupal 7 plus Slate?
To answer the second question, no. Although I don't think it would be that hard to throw it in. It's very flexible, and actually adding a different editor into the Drupal interface is not nearly as difficult as I thought it would be. It would essentially be the same process, I think. And I'm sorry, what was the first question?
Versioning of an article.
Oh, yeah. So there's kind of, so we're actually using the Drupal revisioning system for that. So whenever the node in that JSON field, whenever the code in that JSON field changes and we save the node itself, that's when it creates a new version. So many questions. This guy's had his hand up for a little while.
Sorry.
You guys already work with synchronization. For example, some other person edit the same content at the same time.
Oh, that's a good question.
Or for example, I'm editing the content. Somebody else open it and edit it and save it, but I'm still editing. So when I save, I can't be deleting all of the work that I did.
Yeah, good question.
That's a really good question. We haven't worked on that yet, although there is an initiative in Slate's community to get that working because they want to get a mobile docs collaborative editing sort of feel.
Yeah, I'm currently with that problem right now.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I meant to mention before that part of Slate's community was that they actually have a whole Slack channel that you can sign up for to get more information. Who wants to go first?
Go ahead,
All right,
Greg
Greg.
has gone.
Can you talk a little bit more about the integration of the React Native components into the whole the one design system essentially?
Sure.
Yeah.
Let me go boom, boom, boom. Oh. Can we go back? Where's that?
Yeah, hold on. I should just be able to.
I couldn't
Where would it go?
go up. The up arrow is not working. You have to click on it. Well, while you do that, let me talk. So, sorry, your question was the React Native component strategy for reuse. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah.
Okay. So, we did a couple of proof of concepts here. So originally, right, the pie in the sky vision was, using React Native, we can literally have one bucket of components for all things: mobile, Apple TV, Roku, Amazon Fire, let's say. But what we found, and I think most of the React community is experiencing this, to do component development in a way that is portable across form factors, especially really going from web to non-web, you end up finding yourself in a situation where you're creating more work than you need to. Basically, your simple component ends up becoming this thing with massive if statements to account for the fact if you have, do you even put a hover skate? So I think that it comes down to this. React Native, I think, has a great ethos, which is a component which is agnostic of its viewport, right? And because of that, it purposefully doesn't easily allow for things that are web specific. So in a web experience, you will find that, well, at least we found with our React, so we actually have an application that's React Native Web. And there's things in the application that we were like, man, we should have just done this in React. So what that led us to kind of come to, well, currently, in terms of an opinion, is that shared components, universal, we're talking universal components right? So universal components make sense when the component itself is so sophisticated that you don't want to do it n times per product. So we actually have components like that. So we've got actual components right now, like our scoreboard component on mlsoccer.com. It's highly stateful. It represents all of our matches. If the match happened, is happening, or about to happen, it's and there's crazy pagination with it, and it's pretty close to real time, up to 30 seconds. In our current system, we made this thing 3 times. And when we get a requirement wrong, we have to fix it 3 times. And it required 3 sets of engineers, a PHP Drupal themer. It's a nightmare. So in this kind of situation, we think universal components with React Native all the way. But we're going to be quite quite prudent in making that selection. So I think it's going to come down to a formula that's like, okay, if it's like a super sophisticated component, let's call it, an organism of some sort, or a very, something that's like, well, this is like, we don't want to do this more than once, and it's not going to require too much heavy customization for a web experience, then maybe this will be like a shared universal component. Now, that being said, you'll notice that in our,
Yeah, we don't have.
in our graph, we have shared components across web. So.
All right. If any other questions, definitely come to us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll find it.